Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Campus Speech and the Election, a roundtable. My name is Justin Reynolds. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm the Director of Research Initiatives at ACUHO-I. On behalf of our moderator and panelists, thank you very much for joining. Programs like this are possible because of your membership dollars and the tireless dedication of our volunteers, so we sincerely thank all of you for your support, especially during such a challenging time. Before we get started, I wanted to share some current ACUHO-I initiatives and some housekeeping details. Right now, our volunteer leadership recruitment drive is in full swing. If you've ever had an interest in serving as a chair or chair-elect on an ACUHO-I committee, or you know someone that would be a great fit as an ACUHO-I leader, you can go to ACUHO-I.org/volunteer through November 5th to apply for open positions. ACUHO-I award nominations are now open through November 19th. There are 10 awards currently open for nominations. To nominate someone for an award, you can go to ACUHO-I.org/network/awards. And last but certainly not least is our ACUHO-I Heroes program. If there's a colleague you know that has gone above and beyond the call to ensure the safety and health of students, we encourage you to nominate that person by going to ACUHO-I.org/heroes. You can also learn more about current heroes on that page. We are recording this roundtable, and it will be available on our website as well as in the ACUHO-I online library. We do ask that you keep your mic muted throughout the roundtable. If you do have a question or comment, please use the chat function to submit your question. Without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for today, Louis Inoa of Vassar College. Louis.
Good afternoon, all. Coming from Poughkeepsie, New York. So it's 1 o'clock my time. I'm hoping that wherever you are healthy, that you are well, and that you can be present to this wonderful conversation that we're about to have with folks here. So my name is Luis Jimenez Inoa. I'm the Associate Dean of the College for Student Living and Wellness at Vassar, as mentioned again in good old Poughkeepsie. And this particular subject around campus speech and in this particular moment around the election is something that, we've been thinking about for a long time. I've been in student affairs for 25 plus years. And the conversation was relevant when I started in the profession. And certainly in this particular moment and particular climate that we find ourselves in, just as pressing. And so we're doing a lot of planning on our own campus. It's always good to hear from colleagues about what they're thinking and how they're thinking on this subject. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and allow the panelists to introduce themselves. My pronouns are he, him, his. All right, I'll turn that over to our panelists. We'll start with, do you want to start with Frankie?
Hi, everybody. My name is Frankie Miner, he, him, his pronouns. I'm the current Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of Rhode Island and also Director of Housing and Residential Life. I've been in the field for about 40 years now at a variety of different institutions, but this topic has always been near and dear to me. And also I have the pleasure and benefit of serving as the Residence Education Director on the Executive Board for ACUHO-I. So I feel very passionate about this topic in terms of the fact that not only do we have a tremendous opportunity to create wonderful opportunities for dialogue, I think we have a tremendous responsibility to do that as well, and just trying to figure out how we manage those opportunities and responsibility in a way that's respectful of all opinions. I'll turn it over to my friend Jonathan Friedman, who I just met.
Thanks, Frankie. Hi, everyone. Jonathan Friedman. I am the Program Director for Campus Free Speech at Penn America. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And my connection to this issue at Penn, I have been directing a program for the past 2 years, deeply concerned about the state for open debate on college campuses and the ways in which that debate, in the ways in which that climate can be facilitated to really ensure that we're hearing open debate and the ideas from all students, all faculty, all administrators on some of the contentious issues of the day. During the pandemic, of course, we have been working more virtually to support faculty and staff in how they're hosting virtual conversations, and of course with the election coming up, there's been a lot of questions and concerns about how that can be best facilitated. So I'm happy to kind of answer questions today or contribute to the conversation, speaking from a perspective that really values not just free speech on college campuses, but the ways in which free speech can be balanced and advanced in tandem with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I guess I'm to select next, so let's go to Martha.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Hi, my name is Martha Compton. I currently serve as the Dean of Students at Concordia University, Texas, which is a small private HSI affiliated with the Lutheran Church in Austin, Texas. As the Dean of Students, I supervise housing, and just want to say I'm actually at my house today, but I have been for the last 8 weeks living in a residence hall room for a vacancy while we redid the staff office. So I just want to reiterate my appreciation for housing professionals. It's been about 20 years since I have done that, and you all are amazing. And so thank you for the work that you do with that. So I also have the privilege and honor of serving as the president for the Association for Student Conduct Administration. So some of you may also belong to that group, where we also deal with student behavioral issues, rights and responsibilities across campuses across the country and internationally as well, and support our members in that way. On my personal campus, we are private, and so our rules are a little bit different. We have a little bit more leeway than a public university, although I have 20 years of experience in public higher ed. A lot of that is trying to find the line between our values and mission as an institution and speech that students, faculty, or staff are engaging in on or off campus, particularly when that speech is harmful to other people, and really trying to come back to mission and values alignment, and really how that does or doesn't match there. So happy to talk from that perspective, and any other space of experience I can share. Thanks for having me. And I'll pass this down to Carrie.
Thank you, Martha. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Fox. I currently serve as Director of the Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement at the Rochester Institute of Technology. We are a private, fairly large, about 17,000 students, private university in Western New York, not too far from Buffalo. I also have the pleasure of serving as the Region 2 representative to NASPA's Public Policy Division, and so I can talk from that lens a little bit if that would be helpful as well. And I'm currently a doctoral student, and my research area is kind of in the space of political ego identity development among STEM students in particular. And so a couple of different angles that I could approach this conversation from. In terms of my work at RIT, my office has evolved over time to really have a focus on democratic engagement. You know, we kind of take the civic engagement part of our name pretty seriously, and we talk a lot about the ways in which we're engaging students in critical conversations about their role in society, the challenges that we're facing as a community, and what they can do in support of some of those challenges. More recently, I've had an opportunity also to work on some of our institutions' our freedom of speech and expression policy, and rolling that out and training the community as it relates to kind of the application of that policy, and also doing a lot of work to clarify for our student organizations and students in particular their rights under our political and legislative activities policy. And so we have found that where there is confusion, there can be that can also hinder conversation, that can hinder students' interest and ability to engage in the process and in the systems. And so we are working hard to try to clarify some of those things for students as best we can.
Thank you all for wonderful introduction there. So Jonathan, Carrie, Frankie, and Martha, I appreciate the introduction. I did not mention before I'm the ex officio member on the executive board. Frankie, thank you for reminding me. The Leadership Academy Director, and I'm also a co-chair for the Anti-Racism Task Force that was initiated this year with the ACUHO-I. And so bring some of that particular lens into this conversation, or at least to the questions that I'll be asking our panelists as we move forward. So, and I'll let y'all decide how many of you want to answer these questions. Not feel free that, you know, you don't all have to answer it, but I'm sure you may all have some ideas on here. And Carrie, I think you started to allude to some of this, but for each of you, from your perspectives, how has student engagement in critical dialogue changed since 2016? A widely regarded inflection point for civility. What have you seen? What are you seeing? and I'll let y'all decide. I don't think we're doing this. This is not.
I'll go ahead and get started, Louis. From my perspective in changing, I'd like to move it back a couple more years from that. I've only been at the University of Rhode Island for coming up on 3 years now. Before that, I was almost 25 years at the University of Missouri. In fact, during a time when our students were trying to very much find their voice and how as student affairs professionals we could find that. And what we began to, I think, notice is that students were becoming, particularly our underrepresented students, were tired of trying to use traditional methods for communicating their concerns about inequities that they perceived or were real and experienced on that college campus. And what were the mechanisms they could use for speech to protest that? Whether that was campus protests in the administration buildings, which were always peaceful, or there was infamous sit-ins. Perhaps most notorious is when some of our students also engaged in hunger strikes. And I think what caught the nation's attention is when our football team, so when athletes, particularly athletes of color, began to express their particular voice or use the soapbox or the platform that they had. And so what I've noticed is that, particularly since in my institution and that former institution began with the unfortunate death of Michael Brown, our students began to realize they can be quiet no more. And then we're searching for ways to find and express themselves, but in a way that was not just civil, but in a way that was, I think, potentially uncivil, in a way to draw attention to this. And so these issues of what campus policies allow in terms of free speech, and what they control in terms of behavior or disruption to the campus, I think become some very interesting issues. And what we clearly realized is there were no clear guidelines. Regardless of what court cases may say, each institution is going to have to adopt what their own practices are for doing that. And I think some have done that in very good ways. Others have done it kind of through a series of missteps in trying to control or restrict in dealing with that. So I think the issue is what I've noticed amongst our students and a growing larger, broader segment of our students, not just those who have been political in the past, but are seeking for ways in which to amplify their voices and so that they can be heard in ways in which they felt they've been ignored. One of the touch points that I had with many of those students, though, was this issue of when does free speech, what's tolerable in terms of free speech versus harmful or harassing speech? What should I expect to listen to or hear in terms of a difference of opinion versus something which threatens my individuality or my safety as a person? And I think our students and our institutions are struggling with that in the last few things of how do we encourage that dialogue, but in ways that are still respectful of the people who are participating in that dialogue. So it wasn't a lot of questions, just a lot of, I think, fumbling around at the same time. But I think what we're noticing is the increasing impatience of our students and even more so our faculty or even some of our collective bargaining units, whether they be graduate students or food service workers, trying to find opportunities of how they manage that on our campus. So for me, it's been a really interesting area, but one with a lot more questions than answers.
Chime in. And so I was actually going to say very similar to what Frankie said. I would actually go back to 2014 and the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson was really, I think I saw a significant shift in terms of student behavior on campus and off campus in terms of protests. I think the 2016 election, I was on a different campus in a public institution at that point. One of the things that I saw that was really interesting was that faculty then got involved in a different way than they had been previously. And so while faculty had been, generally supportive of things students were doing, there were protests about Ferguson, there were protests about the Israeli-Palestine conflict on our campus, lots of things there. And faculty only really and there were points where students made deliberate decisions, right? We know it's a student organization tactic going all the way back to the very beginning of the civil rights movement, where people choose to get arrested. They do that, they make that choice. And so students had made that choice. And it wasn't until after the 2016 election where we actually saw faculty en masse kind of trying to intercede on behalf of those students and push the university to respond in a different way from that. I would also say some of the more anonymous vehicles of speech ticked up and ramped up in terms of how hateful and divisive some of that was. So, all of you who work in housing are no stranger to the nasty notes on whiteboards and things like that. That we had a lot of campuses have a free speech wall or someplace where there's graffiti art allowed. And right after all this happened, I remember getting a bunch of calls from colleagues saying, hey, we want to start one of those on our campus. How do we do that? I'm like, don't do it. You can't undo it once it's done. You can't take it back. And once somebody starts putting hateful stuff up there, no matter how quickly somebody else covers it, that damage is done because somebody in your community or adjacent to your community feels that way and felt bold enough to articulate it. So I think that the very clear kind of white supremacist rhetoric, anti-Jewish rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric has become more blatant. I think where things before would be, a little piece of graffiti here and there, something left specifically to tell a specific student, hey, like, this is for you, I see you, has now become more bold in a lot of spaces. And I think that's a really significant challenge, particularly when you are working through spaces where you don't know who owns that speech necessarily. And I think that's a real challenge for campuses.
Thank you both. Some of what I was thinking, and Carrie and Jonathan, both of you have some thoughts on the same question. Feel free to chime in. I am curious about this particular friction in the language that exists around civility and how that's defined, around how we codify protest when in reality, right, protest is not supposed to meet it's not supposed to meet expectations, right? It's meant to disrupt in some ways, possibly. There may be ways to protest without it doing that, but I don't know if we can always control for that. And is there a space to allow for our students, maybe community members, to kind of engage in what John Lewis called good trouble? So this particular friction between civility, protest, and managing for that, and this space for good trouble. And
I think it's the space for all of these things. I mean, I echo everything that Frankie and Martha were saying and dovetails with my experience. I think campuses in general, talking about higher education, and getting your head around all the things that are happening on any one campus in one day, even, before COVID, it's complex. And I think we've seen a public narrative that is constantly trying to shoehorn that into, depending on the political prisms through which you're understanding whatever is going on. And so the vast majority of students, are experimenting with their views. Sometimes they're engaging in speech where they might not even fully understand its implications. Other times they don't understand the seriousness with which they use and kind of throw around certain words. And then they also have a keen sense of kind of agitators. On one hand, we have seen groups on the left or students of color in particular on many campuses in the wake of Mizzou and elsewhere, and in Yale and kind of numerous campuses where we've seen really significant protests, pushing for change, a kind of yearning for a more inclusive campus that feels more equitable for all. And then on the flip side, we've seen organized conservative groups, very sometimes far right-wing groups, who are really trying to influence not just the way the public understands higher education, but the ways that students on campuses should act toward their professors, or act toward each other, or act in residence halls. And so there's a lot going on there. But I think in terms of, that question about like what can be done about this, how do we make space for good trouble? I think that's actually exactly right. It is that people have not appreciated the absolute need to approach these situations with what I call a kind of like even more kind of patience than you would extend to anything else. Like whatever your limit is for patience or tolerance, or for not getting frustrated, to kind of find a way to just find that extra little bit. And that's incredibly difficult when we ask it of students who frankly can be, feel fed up, or are told that, other people or kind of see other people as caricatures rather than as full human beings in whatever these discussions are. But then in particular for administrators and for faculty to recognize that, like, if those those students are staging a sit-in, you know, what is the extreme amount of tolerance and leniency that you can give to understand, like, civil disobedience does kind of have a place. It is a form of speech that has historically been associated with college campuses and should be protected. In the kind of flashpoint moments, if you're on the front lines of that situation, it is hot. It is intense. I mean, to be the kind of administrator or the person who is representing the whole university in this moment with an interaction with students in a moment that's getting maybe local or state or even national attention, that is not easy to ask of people. And yet, the truth is, when we think about how many campuses haven't actually erupted in, you know, complete chaos, the reality is that a lot of people actually been doing a very good job, but they get no credit for this whatsoever. And in my experiences, actually, folks who work in residence halls are actually some of the ones who have been on the front lines of mediating conflict, of trying to facilitate dialogue, of trying to keep cool heads, and you know, just the unsung heroes, honestly. Despite whatever the national narrative is about campuses and about these conversations about protests being completely out of control, I actually think a lot of them have been handled well. That's why we haven't heard as much about them in kind of the national news as we've heard about other things. But I do think there's tensions there, and just because we extend students leniency and we kind of allow maybe some or as much good trouble as we can, there are moments where there probably does have to be line where, you know, it does sometimes mean that some kind of other actions need to be taken. But, you know, I've been in conversations where student protesters have just been completely denigrated. I one time showed a video of a student protest to demonstrate just how much the ways in which people were characterizing it were not accurate. You know, they were saying like the students had shut down this building on campus and were disrupting all of campus operations. And actually the students were making a great deal of noise outside the president's office, but the viral video was of the president acknowledging them and walking into her office and walking by them and walking out and trying to talk with them and trying to engage with them. And so we have to fight against multiple things in these moments, which is the optics, the realities of human interaction, and the challenge of trying to keep a cool head and understand that just as much as those students might be disrupting, they also have rights to free speech, and those rights are human rights that should be encouraged and honored.
Absolutely. And I was just going to add maybe just one point to your question, Luis, is that, you know, I think that something that we oftentimes forget is that protest isn't typically the first thing that people think of when they are trying to address or redress a concern or an issue, right? It takes massive organization. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. Our students would likely prefer to be doing something else. So at the point in time that we've gotten to protest, right, the civility and the civil discourse and the discussions and the dialogue, right, has probably failed, or at least from their perception or their perspective, it has failed, right? And so then protest is the next step, right, to force the conversation, to force the engagement, to be disruptive, right? And so I think that's something that, you know, in terms of as we think about giving our students grace or providing leniency or thinking about the issue from their perspective, is they didn't start at protest. Their engagement with us in some way got them there, right? And so I think we have to be honest with ourselves about how we're engaging with our students in these conversations and what led them to where they got to. I've been at a couple of institutions, not the one I'm at right now, where I saw students who were, you know, when they did a die-in, right, or die out on the quad, right, chalk their bodies out, you know, in protest of police brutality, and when they occupied the administration building for the administration's failure to actively engage in conversations about some challenges on the campus. And so I think that it's our silence sometimes, right, that in our unwillingness to act or to engage, that sometimes can lead students there. So that's one piece. I think the other side that I would think, and this is, I think, for those of you who are in leadership in student affairs or at other parts of the university, you know, I've been in situations where I felt like I had to choose between my administrative hat, right, and my support of students hat, right? And so I think we have to have some critical conversations with each other about which hat are we wearing and when, right? Perhaps I need to wear the administration hat at one point, but someone else in the division or someone else on my team or someone else can wear that student support hat, because we have to figure out how to do both. And I think sometimes that's unclear. So I think that's what I would say.
I'd like to pick up on that last point that Carrie made, because I think that's critically important.
I want to put a bit of...
You want to go ahead, or are you going to go, Louis?
I was going to ask another question, but go ahead, Frankie.
I think Carrie touched on an important point is the support of our staff. I think within, and I think building on something Jonathan said, again, I'm biased towards housing. That's where most of my experience is. But I think those represent tremendous opportunities for those, or environments for those dialogues to occur. You only have to go to a class for 1 hour a day. But in the place where you're living and there's this forced level of interaction, I think there's tremendous opportunity for creating these opportunities for speech and dialogue in a respectful way. It puts a lot of pressure on the housing staff, and again, I think they have a tremendous opportunity that others don't. But I think Carrie's important point, what I found at least my prior institution, are younger professionals are very passionate about these ideas. They're representing things that are very similar to the students that they're living with in many situations or working very closely with. And as young professionals, they're searching for this guidance of how do I express my own personal and sometimes even professional views as what's right or wrong with this institution or this topic, and what is too much, because I also I'm a representative of this institution who's paying my paycheck. And I think, I know at my prior institution, I had to provide some very clear guidelines for them. This is okay. You can go up to this line and I'm gonna support you 100%. As you start to cross over this area, you're getting into a gray area. And freedom of speech doesn't necessarily mean freedom from consequence. It only means freedom from governmental consequence. And then here's where you're kind of getting into under the thin ice. And so I think it's not just empowering our students, it's empowering those younger professionals who have a lot of influence with them and helping them understand what are the boundaries as an institutional representative and as a committed young professional who we want to stand up for these hopefully shared values.
If I may, I just wanted to put a really fine exclamation point on what you said, Carrie, about they didn't start with us marching out in the streets and trying to disrupt. I think that's what, you know, in my work, one of the recurring themes has been just how little people understand or know or have familiarity with the politics or the history of something that's happened on a campus, and yet the whole country is talking about it. I think at just about every single major university controversy that was a campus free speech issue in the past 2 or 3 years, there's kind of like the national story about it, and then there's actually what was happening on the ground in the year that led up to it. And none of it started with, let's protest in this way or let's shut down that. None of it began at that extreme. And you have to, I think it's incredible how little grace, how little consideration has been given to those factors. And to your point, Frankie, I completely agree. This is the thing I'm asked about the most, which is I work in a residence hall or I work in student affairs or even I'm a professor. Where is the line in terms of my political speech and in terms of when I'm representing the university and when I can say certain things and when I can engage in protest myself? And at the end of the day, the lines are a bit blurry. I mean, even just yesterday, I saw a picture circulating of a police officer wearing a Trump mask. And the question was this police officer violating rules about their own neutrality, right? Partisanship in the police is not supposed to be a thing. But then, you know, the immediate question from a legal and from a First Amendment perspective is, well, was he on duty at the time? Where was this picture of this person taken? What were they doing? And I think explaining to young professionals those kinds of nuances is really, really vital.
Thank y'all for the added perspective for that particular question. We have a few more. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get through them. This is not a question, rather than just kind of an ongoing statement around kind of some generational differences in the way that we may be thinking about these issues and responding to these issues, thinking about our you know, entry-level, mid-level professionals and what values are guiding some of their decisions and how they want to act. You know, I could tell you that personally, right? I'm going to be 48, October 25th on Sunday. And so, you know, this next question is around just this moment that we find ourselves in, right? We have this election coming up. We're in the middle of possibly the second wave of this pandemic in COVID-19. We are reckoning with racial justice, anti-racism, anti-Black racism in our country. And at this point in my life, I'm at a place where I'm communicating clearly. I need to see things done. I need to be part of doing something. And so, this line that we might draw for our younger professionals, I think we just need to make sure that we assess where that line is, and that it's not generated by these principles that were established when I was in school in you know, but but for this moment that we find ourselves, I think there is a necessity for recalibration in how we respond, because of how ineffective previous responses have been. And so I'm curious about your sense of, and I'm gonna ask the second question, but it could take us in a variety of ways. It's just how is these issues around engagement and dialogue different, given all that we're experiencing on our campuses, all that's happening in the world and in our country right now?
Well, and Luis, I think part of what you said is so important, right? Thinking about generational differences and who has power in what situation, who holds privilege in what situation, right? So I can sit here and talk pretty openly about white supremacy, and in most situations, nobody's going to really blink or push back that me as a white woman is saying that. And me as a person with positional power on my campus and positional power in my organization. But that's not always true of our younger professionals, right? Especially as we do really good jobs of trying to keep our workplaces equitable and inclusive, and our staff looks different than it did when I was, coming up in housing and everybody looked like me. Understanding that there's balances of power and privilege there, and the expectations that we have around civility and incivility and professional and unprofessional are often coded language for issues of race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is just to say, like, yes, I am with you, but I also know that I have privilege in how I choose to use my voice, because I've been able to get to a point in my career where I have some of those options and reputation nationally, that if I make a misstep and say something, for the most part, there's 20 years of work behind that I can fall back on, that a new professional doesn't always have. And so I think the other piece too is just everything, and I think people can argue one way or another, everything feels really intense right now, and it has felt really intense since March. Like, just this constant not knowing. We as human beings are not great with ambiguity and not having particularly, most of us in student affairs are a little on the type A side. We like to know what's going to happen. We want to plan. We want a backup plan to the plan. And, I don't know about y'all, but we were on plan like BB. We had gone all the way through the alphabet and started over again when we opened this fall. And so I think for our students, it feels that way too. It feels really intense. For a lot of them, this is the first presidential election they've ever had the opportunity to vote in, and we can't forget about that. We know a lot of our students come to campus with ideas, and they may not actually be physically coming to campus this year, which is a whole different nuance of how these discussions are happening. But they come to campus with ideas that they may not have fully explored yet. They believe that they believe something, but they don't necessarily know how or why, or haven't had an alternate opinion. And so I think there's a lot of really good information out there about vote early. It's so important, but there's also messages about like vote for your life. And that feels super intense and intimidating to some folks. And so I think just kind of recognizing that COVID makes everything more challenging. And because of that, it has so impacted not just day-to-day life, obviously, of all of us, but the political rhetoric around everything, which has ramped up, in addition to everything we saw this summer, which, isn't new, but was a new cycle of racial injustice being brought to the forefront of the news cycle. And so students are really feeling a lot of, I think, intensity around that. And sometimes for some folks, that intensity can be paralyzing. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to trust. I don't know what information to trust. And so, how we talk about these things on our campuses can really either inflame that divisiveness, or really maybe help folks to feel empowered to use their own critical thoughts and their voice in ways that are important to them.
The mental health crisis, it's just so real right now on campuses. And echoing what I said a minute ago, I think the country as a whole has just not appreciated exactly what it is we've been asking of higher education professionals. whatsoever. You know, there's a conversation about opening and bringing students back and sending them back, but just kind of the toll of what you're describing, Martha, I think has been underreported on, and just outside of kind of the public imagination is just how much, of course, everything shutting down has a huge impact on all of us, you know, adults and professionals, but for young people emerging, you know, for undergraduates, for that student who just made it out of high school and is starting at the college level, you know, like there are serious challenges around a lot of those issues. And I think also, you know, just to add to this, I think that the day after the 2016 election, it got a lot of attention because campuses were like sites of a great deal of, I think, just a kind of depression, and students just completely shocked that Trump had won. And then other people saying, you know, why is everyone so glum? You know, we have elections every 4 years. What's the big deal? And I think no matter how this goes in the next 2 weeks, you know, that they're saying, you know, like basically no matter what, 40% of the country is just going to be extremely unhappy with 30 to 40%. And that's certainly going to be present on campuses and among young people. So thinking about now how those on the front lines can do their best to offer support for students, regardless of who those students are, and for all students from all backgrounds equally. It's a big priority.
Yeah, I think Jonathan, you hit upon something. I think many of us, as we're preparing for first Halloween, because I think we're all concerned about Halloween and COVID, but once we get past Halloween, then comes the next scary thing, and that's November 3rd, or actually November 4th. And given those of us who experienced what our campuses felt like in 2016, and with the great certainty that we may not have certainty on November 4th, and just the anxiety that that's going to be producing at that point. So I think one of these issues, I think, is critical for how do we prepare for that from just a social mental health point of view. One of the things that concerns me, though, and I don't really have a good answer for, but maybe others are struggling with this, is the tenor and tone of dialogue has changed in the last few years. I'm finding it increasingly frustrating that we're not listening to each other, we're shouting at each other. And whether that's through social media platforms or these echo chambers that our students are playing in. But I don't know that we've empowered our students, or they're seeing very good examples, at least in our national leaders, of people who can engage in respectful dialogue and have difference of opinions, and that speech doesn't mean that one of us is going to, free speech doesn't mean that one of us is going to win with some prevailing opinion, but the fact that we can each express those opinions in a way that doesn't insult the other person. And I think we're doing our students a disservice because I don't know that we've given them the tools how to have that respectful dialogues, or created the environments for doing that as well as we could. I'm sure there's notable examples. I'm familiar with some of the programs that Dr. David Schoen did at Michigan and stuff that created these intentional opportunities for doing it. But that's a real area of concern of mine, is do our students and even our faculty staff as well know how to talk to each other in a way that's not demeaning of the other person, with the fact that you may disagree with their ideas. And I really struggle with this. And I recognize my position of privilege, but one of the conversations I had with many of our student leaders at my former institution when we were going through these terms of protest is they were saying, I shouldn't hear things I find offensive on my college campus. And I would say, in fact, I'm sorry, the one place you might want to expect to hear those kind of things is a college campus, but in a context and in a format and in a forum that doesn't insult you as a person. And the concept may be offensive to you, but it's not threatening or harmful to you. And helping to understand that. So I think this issue of, do we have the same expectations going into these conversations about free speech? Or is it that free speech means me really prevailing with my idea over your idea? Or is it really the dialogue? So I struggle with that. I recognize my privilege in that sense of my position. But I'm trying to help our students, but I'm struggling with that in myself as well.
Yeah, Frankie, I mean, I think if you had the answer to that, you'd probably be a rich man. So I think it's something that we're all struggling with. I think a couple of things. Something that someone had said earlier is this idea of civility and how that can be oppressive, right? How it can be a tool of oppression or a tool used to oppress people in their voices. And I think about that a lot in this context, because I think that, we can have, I think, very civil conversations about a lot of things, right? I think in the environment that we're living in now, that's hyper politicized and hyper polarized, I think it's really hard to have civil conversation when your opinion seems to come at the expense of my humanity, right? It seems to suggest that I am not fully human. I am not fully a part of this community. I'm not fully a part of the society. So I think that that is where the rub is. And so when I hear students say that they don't want to be offended, I don't necessarily hear that. What I hear them saying is, I want in your statement, and I want in what you're saying, I want to understand, I want to feel that you see my humanity, right? And so I think if we can figure out how do we approach the dialogue with and between and among each other, right? But also between and with our students from that perspective of, I'm not asking necessarily not to be offended, but I am asking that, that you honor that I am fully human in the space, that I have agency, that I have voice, that I have experience, that I have history, that I have all these things that make me that come together to form my experience and shape who I am. And I think that too often when we enter spaces and conversations and it's a completely logical exercise or it's a cognitive exercise, we can kind of lose track of that piece. So I think that's one thing I would say. But that doesn't mean I don't believe that we have to engage in the conversations. I think some of the, but I don't know if the dialogue is the place to start. I think if you think about the people in your personal life, in your personal lives, right? It is challenging, but it's also much easier to have a difficult conversation about a really hard topic or controversial topic when there's already a relationship there, when it's someone that you already care about, someone that you're already invested in and they're invested in you, right? So I think starting with the dialogue is probably not the best approach. I think you have to start with your relationship and help it to cultivate those relationships so that then the dialogue can flow, right? That's just my thought.
That is absolutely 100% can't endorse that enough. In my own experience, I grew up in a Jewish, I went to Jewish school. Most of my friends in my community was Jewish growing up. And when I went to college, one of the first friends I made was Palestinian, but I didn't know that at first. And she didn't know that about me. We actually, in the kind of wonderful moment of early college, kind of became friends and were acquaintances, and were invested in the shared sense of humor before we explored each other's identities and political affiliations and all that. And then about a month into knowing one another, suddenly we realized we were supposed to not like each other. And then all of a sudden we got in these like massive disagreements. I mean, hour-long conversations about all kinds of issues. And I always reflect on this because if I hadn't kind of started the relationship with this person first, we never could have had those conversations, which I take and reflect upon as some of the most enlightening of my own experience of college, because I met somebody who was different. And, I do worry a great deal about now with COVID and with this election and with just the incredible polarization we're seeing, where it's just so easy to reduce the other side or whatever side it is to a caricature, that we are losing that opportunity for people to kind of make friendships and then realize they might not be fully friends, or then realize the ways in which friendship can be challenging, and those dialogues with people that are so necessary. So I also want to stress too, good faith in other people and grace and all the things that we started off with, like those can run out, and a lot of the times they have on campuses. You can't expect people to have an endless wellspring of tolerance and grace when other people are coming to campus, or other people are saying things or writing things on their whiteboards that are so incredibly denigrating. And so there has to be, on one hand, a degree of forgiveness, a degree of tolerance, a degree of grace, but there also has to be, on the other hand, a recognition that sometimes conversation and dialogue isn't the answer, and we can't just kind of push people together in rooms and tell them just talk and it'll work out. I think if anything, that often backfires and has a worse impact.
Much appreciated the kind of the full perspective there on that conversation. Y'all have me thinking about a lot about the power of relationships. Often talk about I love working at a small liberal arts college where I have an opportunity to build relationships with a number of students, where they get to know me as a human being in a variety of different ways. But specifically that it allows for moments, particularly when there is tension or when there is crisis, for them to have an understanding that our interactions between us can be transformational and not just simply transactional. And that's part of what y'all are saying, that kind of transactional element of ideas isn't working, right? When the possibilities for transformation aren't there, given the absence of trust, and given the presence of history, right? in our conversations, right? That we need to, again, continue to grapple with. And so, that for me, I'm gonna ask the last question that we have here around like what we're planning to do on our campus for Election Day and possible fallouts for that. But I am, I think one of the things that feels vital is the common language that we have. And so when we talk about, let's just say racism, right? Not just simply the word, but what does that word mean, right? Are we using a similar definition? Thinking about your comment prior to this, Martha, right? There's Ruth Wilson's Gilmore definition of racism is power and difference, right, equals death. And that death could be a social death, right? And so when you think about our entry-level professionals or mid-level professionals, when you think about our students of color, marginalized communities, there is this potential for social death, right, to exist because of this power and difference that exists on our own campuses that we need to continue to grapple with, right? So this language around language and understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about it seems to be important, and this necessity for relationships to exist. I'm curious, as we start to prepare for Election Day, I'm gonna flip this a little bit. You can respond to what I just said before that, but I'm curious about this, what we're doing on our campus for Election Day, and this particular thread around social desirability, right? So it or social that people know they can't communicate who they may be voting for if the majority of the people on their campus aren't going to be voting for that person, right? And so how do we prepare for an election day on our campuses when, and I don't use this lightly, when the minoritized voice, if you will, may be the conservative / Republican / that may be voting for that, that individual on our campus. But we can't talk about it. So we're talking about campus speech. We want our students to engage in this. At least on my campus, those students aren't going to come out and say it, right? It's not socially desirable. As a matter of fact, a concern around their own social deaths on our campus, right, exist. So how are we preparing for Election Day and its aftermath? And maybe I don't need to necessarily censor the students who maybe feel like they can't say something about who they're supporting politically in terms of the party. But I'm curious about that. And then I'm obviously curious about just how we deal with the aftermath of it all.
I'll start. We have a really interesting campus population in that we are a Christian university affiliated with the Lutheran Church, but we're also a Hispanic serving institution. We have a significant number of students who are Pell Grant recipients and first gen. And so there's a lot of mix of conservative views and folks who typically might skew a little bit more liberal. And so our conversations when we've pulled programs together have really focused less on candidates and more on issues. Let's talk about how you feel about this thing and why, and how you got to that belief. And because we're a faith-based institution, we have the conversation about how does your faith inform your belief here? How has your faith challenged your belief here? And trying to create the space to talk more about the what than the who, if that makes any sense. I'm very lucky, and I'm knocking on all sorts of wood, that for the most part, our students are not hugely an activist population. We have a lot of students who are commuter students at work and skew a little older and have families and stuff of their own. And so I don't particularly expect our campus to be too much of a hotbed of activity around the election, but we have really been focused on trying to get people to understand kind of the opportunity and the civic duty that we all have when we are privileged enough to, those of us who are privileged enough to have the opportunity to vote.
I can jump in. I will say that this is a work in progress. That we don't have any great answers. I think right now, I think the conversations are happening. I think one of the things, I think there's a couple of things that we're thinking about. One is this kind of idea that just as kind of interpersonal relationships, I think, are important in the context of dialogue and of engaging in effective dialogue. I think that that's also true at the organizational level. And so one of the things that we're talking a lot about is, for our students who are more activist minded, for our students who are more likely to be hurt or to be excited or to be angry or to be happy or whatever the feeling, right? where are those students' relationships on campus, right? Are there relationships with our Division of Diversity and Inclusion and faculty and staff, our staff in that area? Are they with particular colleges on campus? I think that one of the things that we're getting our heads around right now is that our silos aren't serving us well right now in terms of our supportive students, right? And so we're trying to pull together people from various offices, various units, various divisions to engage in some conversations about how do we support our students effectively? Where are your relationships, where are ours, and how do we leverage those relationships in support of kind of the student experience during and post election? So I think that's one thing that we're trying to figure out. I mean, all the way up to including public safety, right? Because if they come in after the election a little bit heavy-handed, then it's going then that has the potential to create some additional challenges for us, right? And so looping in the relevant partners, I think, has been important to us. And then one of the other things that we're talking about now, we've never done this before, is kind of leveraging our counseling center, not for individual or for group counseling sessions, but to create spaces where students can debrief and can process in groups together, right, with experts who are trained to be able to do that. And so that's another thing. We don't have the form or the shape of that yet, but that's another thing that we're thinking. So again, no answers, but thoughts.
Yeah, again, I wish I had a more clear plan on what we're doing. I can tell you what's being discussed at this point. First of all, we do have Election Day as a holiday for staff, and school is not in session, so everyone will have ample time on that day doing that. What we're actually doing in the residence halls is going back and revisiting our COVID assembly guidelines. How many students can we get into common spaces safely to do that? Not only is the weather getting cold for us up here, but we're sensing maybe we can do some watch parties or something so we can have some sort of group experience in still kind of a safe way, so we can get a temperature gauge pretty quickly on how people are responding and reacting to that, and have those opportunities for that sense of community. We're also sadly on our campus, particularly around sporting events, Patriots, Celtics, and Red Sox are prone to campus protests with dumpster fires. I don't know, it seems to be a thing here. So we're trying to figure out how do we make sure, just from even in some situations, either celebratory or protesting in a way, and just kind of outrageous behavior. But I think, as I mentioned before, part of my concern is, I think we've been building to this moment, and there's going to be an expectation that we're going to have some resolution by the end of the evening on November 3rd. And just looking at the political posturing and what's going on now, my sense is we're dealing with that level of not only that anxiety that we felt or on many of our campuses in 2016, but that being over an extended period of time because there's uncertainty with that. And so, yeah, our counseling center staff, which is operating mostly virtually at this point, how can we respond to those situations? So I think it's, going back to one of Jonathan's points early on, I think it's going to fall, at least on our campus or our residential campus, a lot to the residence hall staff, because that's where the students are going to be initially, at least for our campus, because they're not going to be in class on that particular day.
I appreciate the response. Jonathan, you're about to jump
Yeah,
in?
I was going to jump in. So I wanted to let you all go first because you're on campuses and we're kind of in this cross-campus role. But just I was going to drop in a chat here a link to Penn America's 2020 election efforts, which center actually on the issue of disinformation. And what we're going to be doing, one of the things that we've been doing this fall and we'll be continuing to do after the election, is talking about disinformation as a free speech issue. Some of you might know Penn is actually an almost 100-year-old organization. And in our 1948 charter, not only are we committed to defending free speech, but also dispelling hate, which makes some of our work on campuses very interesting, since we have that kind of anti-hate element very strongly in our work alongside supporting free speech. But we also have a commitment to standing against misinformation, disinformation, false, what we now call fake news, but some of the issues that we've seen rear their heads. And so we've thought a lot about that nuance between, where should we draw the lines around free speech and where do we draw the lines around, public information. And of course, that's become a major issue this fall, not only related to COVID, but the election and its aftermath as well. So I encourage all of you, if you have opportunities, to not only participate in our pledge or take our quiz or your own knowledge of disinformation, but if there are opportunities and that's a useful resource, we have had some students use it as well, and they've reviewed it positively.
Thank you. I think we have a few more minutes. I don't know if there's any questions there. Thank you for sharing the resource there, Jonathan. Really appreciate it. Some of the stuff on our campus, I think we're in the same spot that everyone is. We're still trying to sort out exactly what to do and say here. I am working with our counseling services here to offer a training for our administrators on campus on how to debrief. The sense that all conversations, particularly when students are having some difficulty, need to be counseling led. For me, is something that I want to make sure that there's an institutional capacity for all of us to sit in space with our students when they're grappling, or we may be grappling with the same issues, right? So having a training on debriefing. The other thing I'm trying to institute rather quickly, and maybe it's a ritual for every Friday, is like a, scream at the top of your lungs every Friday, something to release the tension. I like to remind folks that we are in for, for a rather intense set of days. 31st is Halloween falls on a Saturday on campuses that have been rather restricted, and our students are looking for reasons to let loose a little bit. Then follow that up with the Tuesday election and then the aftermath from there. I think I say that, for folks to make sure that we take care of ourselves, that we prepare ourselves for a bit of the amount of energy that we are going to be expending in caring for our students and for one another. In that mode, I'm trying to take off a day or two and encourage people to try to find some time to care for yourself, right? To kind of put that air mask on yourself first before we tend to both, again, just these days that are coming up and what we're seeing across the country in terms of a spike in COVID that we're all really concerned about. So just want to put that out there. Any last final thoughts, Jonathan, Frankie, Martha, Carrie, anything on your mind that you'd like to share?
No, just best wishes with everybody. And I think hopefully this has been somewhat instructional, if not the fact commiserating for you that we're all dealing with the same issues if you didn't get any hard and fast solutions for it. But I do think this is an issue that's going to supersede or continue past the election. I think we're going to continue to have dialogues and conversations about this important topic, because I think our students are increasingly starting to find their voice. And as I said, mentioned, that's now including faculty, staff, and other kind of even graduate students and other unionized workers as well. So I think this is going to be a topic for a while.
I just wanted to jump in at the end with a plug for slightly related but other issue for anyone interested. I know there's been a lot of chatter in higher education about the executive order on race and sex stereotyping and the ways in which that is impacting campuses. So wanted to invite anyone here interested. We've organized an open forum for a conversation about the executive order on Friday afternoon Eastern. If anyone would like to join, it's open. And we're also trying to collect anecdotes of the ways in which this has had an impact on campuses. So if you know of a campus or on your own campus, or you have a friend who's told you that their diversity program or an academic talk or some other kind of training has been postponed or canceled or otherwise subject to some kind of review, I just want to make clear that as a free speech organization, we view this as an act of censorship by the government of the worst kind, and we are organizing to try and respond to it. And so please, anyone here who could help us get the word out about this survey, we're trying to bring the stories that I think a lot of us have been hearing about this happening into one place to raise public awareness about it.
Thank you again. Let's all just take a deep breath.
Woo.
And let that out. Folks, again, take care of yourselves. I know that we've talked a lot about what we're doing for our students. Again, I just that reminder to take care of ourselves. But also, like, if anybody's interested, I'm up for engaging in these conversations in much smaller groups and much more private and personal groups. I think we often worry about how our students handle this and maybe don't realize that we need practice at engaging in difficult dialogues amongst each other. So colleagues, if you're out there, my colleagues here, if you want to, I'm up for setting up some more private time to talk through some of these more difficult things, practice these things ourselves, and learn right through experience as well. All right, friends, y'all take care. Have a great day, great week, great rest of the semester.